Assalamu alaikum ji. We are into the 43rd lecture today of History and Systems of Psychology. उम्मीद है अब तक आप अगर पूरे नहीं तो तकरीबन निस्फ माहिर नफ्सियात बन चुके होंगे या आपको नफ्सियात के बारे में काफ़ी आगाही हासिल हो चुकी होगी. मैं आपको शुरू के लेक्चर्स के दौरान इस चीज़ की बहुत नसीहत करता रहा हूँ कि आप रिवाइज़ ज़रूर कीजिए. उम्मीद है आप मेरी नसीहत पे अमल करते रहे होंगे और ये जो भी मवाद हमने कवर किया है, पढ़ा है, इसे आप ख़ुद रिवाइज़ करते रहे होंगे. अगर ऐसा आपने किया है तो जैसे मैंने पहले कहा, आप मुकम्मल नहीं तो निस्फ माहिर नफ्सियात तो बन चुके होंगे. हमने अब तक क़ब्ल अज़ मसीह से लेके 20वीं सदी के तकरीबन आखिर तक नफ्सियात के इर्तिका का एक जायज़ा लिया है. मैं ये तो नहीं कहूँगा कि हमने मुकम्मल तौर पे उसको पढ़ा है और समझा है और जाना है, लेकिन ये ज़रूर है कि तकरीबन 300 बरस पहले क़ब्ल मसीह से बिफोर क्राइस्ट अप टू द लेट 20th century we have seen the prominent development, the prominent contributions, prominent names in the field of psychology, and we have brought it up to the present times. We will now look into, in the next two lectures, that is today and today onwards, we will look into some of the most recently developed areas in psychology, that is the development of psychology in the 21st century. We will look into 6 or 7 or 8 areas, but before I go there, let us first review what we had done in the last lecture. Can you recall where were we in the last lecture? In the last two lectures, if you recall, we had been talking about psychology in the third world countries. And in the last lecture, in reference to the psychology in the third world countries, we particularly talked about two countries in this region, that is People's Republic of China and our own country, Pakistan. We looked into the Chinese psychology from the point of view of psychology and psychological development in China before the Chinese Revolution, that is 1949, and then we looked at the Chinese psychology or the condition of Chinese psychological literature and psychological research and the condition of psychology in China after 1949, that is after the takeover of the Chinese Communist Party. If you remember, I had told you that the Chinese psychology prior to 1949, that is before the revolution of 1949, there was a tremendous influence of American psychological literature and American psychological thought on the Chinese main soil. And in particular, the viewpoints of two American psychologists were predominantly taught at colleges at the Chinese universities, and those two American psychologists were William James and John Dewey. I told you their books were translated into Chinese language, and I told you that their books and their ideas were taught. I also told you that John Dewey, the American psychologist that we had become familiar with earlier on, had toured China and delivered lectures at various institutions and universities in China. That was before the Chinese Revolution, before the Chinese took over, the Chinese Communist Party took over. After the revolution, as you remember, in 1950, the state recognized psychology in China as an important field of investigation and an important science. And the Chinese set up a commission in 1956 that was established to look into what fields of psychology should be developed and should the Chinese psychologists concentrate upon. As a result of the deliberation of this commission in 1956, the Chinese commission recommended that Chinese psychologists should develop mainly 3 areas of psychological approach, and one of these 3 areas was, if you remember, clinical psychology, the other was psychology of labor and work, and the third was educational psychology. If you remember, in China, the aspect that was looked into from the point of view of the clinical psychology was related to the diagnostics and treatment of mental diseases, particularly schizophrenia and manic depressive psychosis. You remember I told you in that context they had developed a methodology of treatment of their own that they call the speedy synthetic method. That was one area of development that the Chinese psychologists expanded in after 1949. The other area that they expanded in, they looked into, if you remember, was the area of psychology of labor or psychology of work, where they regarded physical or manual labor to be superior and made manual or physical labor a part of everyday life. The third area that they looked into, if you remember, was educational psychology. The Chinese psychologists made manual labor a part of educational curriculum of all educational institutions across China. That was one main aspect of the development of educational psychology in China. Another was the Chinese educational psychologists looked at what was the ideal age for children to begin schooling and what was the ideal age for children to be studying particular subjects. So these were the 3 areas that after the revolution the Chinese started looking into. This was one of the third world countries and the development of psychology in one of the third world countries, that is People's Republic of China. That is what we looked into in the last lecture. We also looked at the development of psychology in another third world country, that is Pakistan. In Pakistan, I related to you that at the time of independence, Pakistan offered master's degrees only at 2 institutions. Number one, at Dhaka University in East Pakistan, which was then East Pakistan, and the other at Government College Lahore, which was affiliated to Punjab University. These 2 institutions offered master's degrees. Later in the decades of late 50s and late 60s, many postgraduate departments cropped up. One of them at the Punjab University, another one at Rajshahi University in East Pakistan, another one at Karachi University, another one at Peshawar University. Now, many educational institutions offer master's level courses and master's level degrees in Pakistan. East Pakistan separated in 1971 and became a separate country, Bangladesh, as you know, and that was what we were talking about. So in Pakistan, whatever we were left with, we concentrated in psychology in the areas of social psychology, clinical psychology, experimental and general psychology, and psychological measurement. हमारे मुल्क में इन्हीं सब्जेक्ट्स पे, इन्हीं कॉन्सेंट्रेशंस पे ज़्यादा तवज्जो दी जाती रही है. That was one of the aspects of the development of psychology in Pakistan. Then I talked about another institution was set up. In the early 70s, a National Institute of Psychology was set up at Islamabad. The main function of the National Institute of Psychology was to undertake psychological research, and their areas of research were developmental psychology, forensic psychology, measurement, cross-cultural comparisons. These were some of the main areas. The National Institute of Psychology later merged into Islamabad University. Another thing that we mentioned in relation to Pakistan, the development of psychology in Pakistan, was the establishment of Pakistan Psychological Association, or PPA for short. PPA, or Pakistan Psychological Association, is an association of psychologists who hold a minimum of master's degree. Only those people can become members of the association who hold this minimum degree, and then these members of the association elect their bodies. Then there is a president, then secretary and vice presidents, and members of the other executive board. And the main function of Pakistan Psychological Association is to hold seminars, hold meetings, and hold discussions related to psychological topics. This is the state of affairs of psychology in Pakistan today. Pakistani universities and institutions that produce graduates are absorbed in many fields in Pakistan, fields in the state or the public sector, and fields in the private sector. I told you that perhaps in Pakistan, there is a very high demand of trained psychologists, both in the public sector and in the private sector. In the public sector, psychologists are absorbed in public service commissions, in the armed forces, in educational institutions, in the labor department, in the social welfare department, in hospitals. And in the private sector, psychologists are absorbed in educational institutions. As in the public sector, psychologists are also absorbed in Pakistan, in the private sector, in research agencies, in advertising agencies, and in marketing agencies. So there is a great scope for people who graduate, who hold master's degrees in psychology in Pakistan today. That was the third country related to the third world that we had talked about in our previous lecture. This was the section related to the development of psychology in the third world countries. We talked about Africa, we talked about China, and we talked about Pakistan. Let us now come in the 21st century, and let us take a look at some of the developments of psychology that have taken place in the 21st century. The development started, of course, in the middle 20th century and have continued to develop into the 21st century. Some areas that I'm going to touch upon today, one of those is industrial and organizational psychology. Actually, these are two different fields, but since you are at the undergraduate level, we will deal it, and since these two fields are closely related to each other, I will just give you the outline of these two fields and consider these industrial and educational psychology, organizational psychology, as just one main area of development that has taken place in the 21st century in psychology. Industrial and organizational psychology, as you can guess from the name, is the application of psychological principles to industry and organizations. Industry वो है जहाँ कुछ चीज़ें बनती हैं. मसलन एक जूते बनाने की फैक्ट्री इंडस्ट्री है, कपड़ा बनाने की फैक्ट्री इंडस्ट्री है, आइसक्रीम बनाने की जगह इंडस्ट्री है. ये इंडस्ट्रीज हैं. उसके अलावा भी लोगों की ऑर्गेनाइजेशंस होती हैं, मसलन एजुकेशनल इंस्टीट्यूशंस, मसलन हस्पताल, मसलन क्लब्स, ये भी इंस्टीट्यूशंस हैं. So, industrial and educational psychology relate to where groups of people work together to achieve an overall end to achieve an overall goal. Industrial organizational psychology is really a baby of the late 20th century and early 21st century. अभी ये साइंस जो है ये अपने मेच्योरिटी पे पहुंच गई है. अभी देखते हैं what are some of the main topics in industrial and organizational psychology. Let us take a look at the first topic, organizational design. All organizations have designs. Some organizations are tall, some organizations are relatively flat and vertical. Some organizations exist in actual space, some organizations are virtual organizations. Organization A that produces shoes, for instance, is an organization which has a different design from the organization that you are watching this lecture on. It's a virtual organization that you are watching my lecture on because it has its place at it has its recording at one place, it has its reception at another place, it has its exam at the third place, and so on and so forth. So, then there are organizations that are vertical organizations. Vertical organizations are those where hierarchy of decision making or where hierarchy of command exists. Armed forces anywhere in the world are vertical organizations. And then there are horizontal organizations where there is less command structure, where decision-making related to organizations are based upon consensus. So these are the different designs of organizations. Then we also talk about organizations that have a culture. Do you think all organizations have culture? Yes, all organizations have their own particular culture. Psychologists, as they are interested in looking at the designs of organizations, they are also interested in looking at the culture of the organization. The culture of the organization is overall related to the goal of the organization. The armed forces culture is completely different. If you take a look at armed forces, an institution and an organization such as the armed forces organization, its culture is different from an organization, for instance, where education is imparted. In the organization where armed forces personnel are being trained, there is strong culture. In the organizations where education is taking place, there is relatively less strong culture or relatively weak culture. Weak culture or strong culture does not mean good or bad culture, inferior or superior culture. It means, strong culture means that there are more people and more adherence to cultural tradition and mores and norms in an organization where there is strong culture. And where there is a weak culture, there is less adherence, relatively less adherence to practicing the norms of the culture of the organization. So don't confuse weakness of organizational culture with inferiority and strength of organizational culture with superiority. That's not true. The fact remains that all organizations have their own culture. The culture of, for instance, a multinational bank is different from the culture of a local bank. The culture of a multinational restaurant is different from the culture of a local restaurant. ऐसा ही है या नहीं? So here we are talking about culture that exists in organizations, and this is one of the important elements of organizational or industrial psychology. Another topic that organizational psychologists look into or are interested is the topic of globalization. This is a buzzword. आजकल हर शख्स globalization का लफ्ज़ इस्तेमाल कर रहा है. क्या आपका ख्याल है? क्या globalization में कुछ सच का, इस टर्म में कुछ सच भी है, या ये सिर्फ टर्म जो है ये लोगों को इम्प्रेस करने के लिए इस्तेमाल की जाती है. क्या ख्याल है आपका? Globalization is a fact. It is a fact if you look at globalization from the angle of internationalization of market. Markets have become internationalized. Economic barriers have disappeared. You can make a product here and sell it in China or sell it in America or sell it in Africa. And the Africans can make a product and sell it in America or sell it in Australia or sell it in Pakistan. So, markets have been internationalized. That's one aspect of globalization. Another aspect of globalization is inflow or movement of capital. There is now free flow of capital across continents. सरमाया जो है वो एक कॉन्टिनेंट से दूसरे कॉन्टिनेंट में जा सकता है, उस पर अब वो बार्स नहीं हैं जो पहले थी. Another aspect of globalization is free movement of labor. There are many groups of people that could move from one country or one region to another country and another region. All of these constitute the process of globalization. इसलिए globalization is not a buzzword, it is real. Now, globalization, do you think, has it affected organizations? Of course it has. Has it affected psychology of people in the organizations? Of course it has. So, psychologists are looking into the effect that globalization has. We are not talking about good or bad, negative or positive. We are looking at both. Psychologists don't make value judgments. They study things as they are. So we are looking into globalization as globalization impacts, influences organizations. And the psychology of people in organizations. So that's another topic of globalization in the overall area of industrial and organizational psychology. एक point out जो मैं बात इस reference में करना चाहूँगा वो ये है, आपका क्या ख्याल है? Is globalization a recent phenomena or has it been there for all times to come? Or has it been there since ages? क्या ख्याल है? I'll give you 3 seconds to give your thoughts on this. Is globalization or an old phenomenon? Well, you seem to think it's a recent phenomena. That's not true. When Alexander the Great came to this subcontinent and brought his armies and brought his culture and brought his ways of life, that was a kind of globalization. When the Arabians came to this part of the world and brought their own religion, and we accepted that religion with open arms, and we are proud of that religion, that was a process of globalization. When people from here migrated to other countries of the world, that was globalization. So globalization is not a new phenomena, it's an old phenomena. The only difference is, because of rapid communication and transportation, the process of globalization has gained tremendous velocity, tremendous speed. इसकी मिकदार में और इसके रफ्तार में बहुत ज़्यादा तेज़ी आ गई है, लेकिन globalization, as we understand movement of labor, movement of ideas, movement of cultural influences, it has always been there. The only difference is that now it has gained tremendous momentum and speed and velocity. So don't think it's a new phenomenon. That is what organizational psychologists look at. That's one area that they want to understand. Another area that they want to understand, which is related to globalization, is diversity. All organizations are moving towards diversity. Diversity means having people from different backgrounds in organizations. कोई एक ऑर्गेनाइजेशन में कोई हिंदू है, कोई मुसलमान है, कोई ईसाई है, ये लोग शामिल हैं. एक ऑर्गेनाइजेशन में औरतें भी हैं, मर्द भी हैं. एक ऑर्गेनाइजेशन में कम उम्र के लोग, दरमियानी उम्र के लोग और बड़ी उम्र के लोग भी मौजूद हैं. एक ही उसी ऑर्गेनाइजेशन में पढ़े लिखे, ज्यादा पढ़े लिखे और कम पढ़े लिखे लोग भी मौजूद हैं. So organizations have different types of people that impact the organization as a whole, and this diversity also impacts people and psychology of people in the organization. That is what organizational psychology looks at. Another topic that organizational psychology looks at is how to motivate people in organizations, particularly industrial organizations. We know that if the workers are motivated, their productivity increases. And all industries would like their productivity of the workers to be increased. If the workers were producing, let us say, 5 yards of cloth, and if by increasing their motivation, the industrialist could increase the productivity of the worker to, let us say, 12 yards of cloth, then he would welcome it. If in an organization a worker produces one design for an advertisement, and by motivating him, the organizational leaders could ask the workers to produce 2 advertising designs or 3 advertising designs, then of course the organizational psychologist or industrialist would welcome that. And this is what the industrial and the organizational psychologist is interested in, is looking into. How to motivate workers? What is the nature of motivation? What are the other elements that motivation is related to? What is it that motivates people to go forward? What is it that motivates people to go backwards? In other words, what motivates people and what demotivates them? Industrial organizational psychologists are looking into those. Industrial organizational psychologists are also looking into attitudes. We know that attitudes influence organizations as a whole. A negative attitude towards, for instance, the authority figure would negatively impact the industry and the organization. A positive attitude towards an authority figure, the leader, would positively impact the industry or the organization. So, industrial and organizational psychologists needs to look at and do look at attitudes, their formation. What are their ingredients? How can they be changed or modified? What measures can psychologists or organizational behaviorists or industrial psychologists adopt to change and modify attitudes so that those attitudes could become more conducive for the industry and the organization as a whole? Another topic that industrial organizational psychologists look at is the phenomenon of leadership. What do you think? Are leaders born or are they made? Give me your guess. I'll give you 2 seconds. You would think that leaders are born, right? Wrong. Leaders are, industrial psychologists, organizational psychologists are beginning to discover that leaders are not born, that leaders are made. They have, industrial and organizational psychologists have identified the roles that leaders play in industry and organizations. And they have started training people to play those roles. So, industrial and organizational psychologists are creating leaders. As I said, they have been able to identify 12 or 13 or 20 characteristics or roles that leaders play or roles that make people into leaders. And now they have set up institutions where people are taught to play those roles. People are trained to play those roles. So they are producing ideal or good leaders because now they are training people into leadership roles. So leaders are not born, industrial organizational psychologists have found out in the 21st century. They are made. And this is another area that organizational industrial psychologists are looking into. Another area that organizational and industrial psychologists are looking into is, why is it that there are no women leaders or less women leaders? Can you think of an organization or an industry which is leaderless? Interesting questions. Research shows in relation to industrial organizational psychology that those industries and organizations which are headed by women are considered to be more honest and less corrupt as compared to those organizations which are headed by men. Interesting experiments. Industrial organizational psychologists have observed organizations across the globe, and have come to the conclusion, have seen that organizations and industries that are headed by women, आप में से ख़वातीन हैं, वो ये इस रिसर्च का जान के खुश हुई होंगी. Industrial organizational psychologists have found out that those organizations headed by women are considered less corrupt by people in the organizations and by people outside of the organizations. Both the insiders and the public regards organizations headed by females as less corrupt and more honest. Interesting. Another aspect, another thing that industrial organizational psychologists are looking at is the area of stress. Stress, दबाव, जिसको हम नफ्सियाती दबाव कहते हैं उर्दू में. One small research shows that stress causes a loss of $300 billion. $300 billion to the American economy alone. Add to that the loss that is caused by stress from such developed countries as Germany, such developed countries as Japan, Canada, other European countries, and you would see that stress causes a loss of trillions of dollars. खरबों डॉलर सालाना नफ्सियाती दबाव की वजह से इंडस्ट्री को और ऑर्गेनाइजेशन को नुकसान हो रहा है. This is what industrial and organizational psychologists are looking into. Excuse me. The nature of stress, what causes stress, and how the industrial or educational psychologist can help to alleviate that stress, to lessen that stress. That is an important area that industrial organizational psychologist looks into. Another area that industrial organizational psychologists are looking into is the problem of fatigue. Stress and fatigue, research shows, are closely related. Fatigue is, or stress is, a reaction of the organism to noxious stimuli in the industry or the organization. Fatigue is also due to overwork or noxious stimuli in the organization. So, we know as industrial and educational psychologists, organizational psychologists, that fatigue is related to stress, and fatigue is a cause of a tremendous amount of loss to the industry or the organization. Another area that they are looking into is the area of selection of personnel. Who is to be selected for a particular job? Psychologists related to industry and organization use the term fit. You require a fit between a job and a person to be able to get the best out of the person for the industry or the organization. There needs to be a fit. You can't have a square peg in a round hole. So, that is another area that industrial and educational and organizational psychologists are looking into. Another area that they are looking into is the area of training. An industry or an organization is ever changing. An industry or an organization that does not change will perish because the rest of the world is changing anyway. So if the industry or the organization does not keep pace with the latest cutting edge technology in their own sphere, then they would be out of the race. Some of the problems that this country faced in the past was that it did not face up to the challenge of rapid development that was taking place all across the globe. And that is where we were left behind. That is one of the reasons why Pakistan's industry or education system or other areas did not develop, because it did not keep pace with the rapidly developing world industry, world educational system, and the rapidly changing world. In order to be able to make an industry and an organization competitive, training has to be imparted. So, industrial and organizational psychologist is also interested in training. Who to train, how to get feedback on training, and then how to fit the trained person in a particular job. All of these areas are related to what we have termed industrial organizational psychology. That is one of the most recent areas that have developed in the 21st century. Industrial organizational psychology. Let us take another look at a different area that has come about in the recent development of psychology, and that is the area of environmental psychology. Environmental psychology relates to the influence of the environment on human psychology and the influence of human psychology upon the environment. Environmental psychology is a recently developed subject which studies this two-way sword, a double-edged razor, a double-edged blade. Environment influences, environmental psychologists know, human psychology, and human psychology, environmental psychologists know, also influences environment. आप जानते हैं कि because of unchecked industrial growth in Europe and the North American continent, mankind has seen many catastrophes. Those catastrophes include a general raise in the temperature of the world. We call this the greenhouse effect. We have also seen, as a result of unchecked industrial growth, a depletion in the environment that protected us from the negative rays of the sun. We have seen, as a result of unchecked industrial development, a pollution of the environment that has affected the health of the people in the country. As a result of unchecked industrial development, we are witnessing a disappearance of forests and jungles from the face of the earth. Trees are disappearing and buildings are coming up. All of these things are parts of an environment, and they impact our psychology. They influence our psychology. That's one aspect that the environmental psychologist is interested in. The other aspect that the environmental psychologist is interested in is how human psychology affects the environment. इसकी मिसाल यूं भी है कि एक शख्स का जो घर है वो उसके नफ्सियात का मजहर है, उसका कमरा उसकी ज़ाती नफ्सियात का इजहार है, उसका ड्रेस उसकी ज़ाती नफ्सियात का इजहार है. ये सारी चीज़ें जो हैं, किस तरह के घर में रहता है, किस तरह के शहर में रहता है, उसने घर की डेकोरेशन क्या की है, उसका फर्नीचर कैसा है, उसके पर्दे कैसे हैं, वगैरह वगैरह वगैरह, ये तमाम चीज़ें जो हैं, these are expressions of man's psychology. So, environmental psychology or environmental psychologists are psychologists who study the process of how environment influences psychology and how psychology in turn influences environment. There are 2 or 3 things that I need to touch upon that you need to know in this context. That is the concept of personal space. Personal space is the area that a person considers his own territory around his body. माहिरीन नफ्सियात ने यह देखा है कि तकरीबन हमारे जिस्म से लेके 12 इंच या तकरीबन 1.5 फुट तक का जो एरिया है वो उसको हम अपनी पर्सनल स्पेस समझते हैं और हम उसमें किसी दूसरे शख्स को एंटर नहीं होने देते. Only those people may enter the personal space who are very intimate. Husband and wife, children may enter, or parents or brothers or sisters may enter that personal space. If somebody else wants to enter that personal space, the person requires that as an attack on him. He becomes aggressive when somebody tries to enter his personal space. That's one thing that environmental psychologists are studying. What is personal space? How does one personalizes personal space? What happens to one's psychology when personal space is violated? How do people allow other people to violate that personal space? All of these are topics that are related to environmental psychology. Another topic that environmental psychologists look into, they have borrowed from comparative psychology or animal psychology, the concept of territoriality. Territoriality is that animals in the jungle, in the wildlife form, consider certain territories as their personal domain. And if any other animal, even of the same species, enter that area, those animals that reside in that territory attack the animal, attack the intruder, and either shoo him away, send him away, or kill him. Animals are so particular about their territory, and this behavior is called territoriality. Environmental psychologists are studying territoriality in human beings. Territoriality in human beings is being studied because some psychologists are of the point of view, some environmental psychologists are of the point of view that it is the perceived violation of territoriality that leads to wars between nations. Wars are understood by some environmental psychologists as a function of, as a reaction of violation of territoriality by some outside group, and they are formulating their own theories. So this is one aspect that environmental psychologists are looking into. Another area that environmental psychologists are looking into is what is called the area of environmental toxins, जो हमारे माहौल में जहरीले असरात या जहरीले मादे हैं, उनका इंसान की नफ्सियात पे क्या असर पड़ रहा है. गो के उनमें से ज़्यादातर जो अनासिर हैं वो इंसान की अपनी पैदावार हैं, ताहम उनका भी एक बहुत मुज़िर असर पड़ता है इंसानी नफ्सियात पे, और environmental psychologists are interested in looking into the influence of environmental toxins on human psychology. Noxious stimuli, noise for instance, noxious stimuli, pollution in the air for instance, noxious stimuli, all kinds of odors in the environment, all of these have influence on the psychology of humans. Pollution in the air, extreme temperatures may affect psychology, pollution affects psychology, noise affects psychology, all kinds of toxins affect psychology. And this is another area in environmental psychology. Environmental psychology is therefore another one of the recent 21st century developments in the progress of psychology. इसका 19वीं सदी में आप जिक्र नहीं सुनते थे, इसलिए कि उस वक्त तो एनवायरनमेंट को ह्यूमन बीइंग्स ने इतना थ्रेटन भी नहीं किया था. Prior to industrial age, prior to industrial revolution, man had not threatened the environment so much as he started to threaten it after the industrial revolution. So, the subject matter of environmental psychology slowly and gradually developed when the need arose to look at the effect of the environment on psychology and the effect of psychology on the environment. These are the two areas that have recently developed in the modern psychology, psychology in the 21st century. Areas of industrial/organizational psychology and in area of environmental psychology. Before I end today's lecture, let me review for you what we talked about today. We talked about two main areas of development in psychology, two main systems that have emerged in psychology beginning the middle of the 20th century and becoming independent fields in the later 20th century and in the 21st century. One area is what has been called industrial/organizational psychology, and the other area that has been called environmental psychology. Industrial touched upon such topics as stress, such topics as fatigue, such topics as diversity, such topics as organizational culture. We talked about globalization, we talked about diversity, we talked about leadership, we talked about women leadership, we talked about how selection may take place, then we talked about the importance of training. These are all areas that are in the overall field of industrial organizational psychology. That was one part that we touched upon, industrial/organizational psychology. The other area that we touched upon was what has been called environmental psychology. Environmental psychology studies the impact of human psychology on the environment and then the impact of environment on human psychology. It studies that dialectical relationship, the cause and effect relationship between human psychology and environment. Human psychology influences, human behavior influences, human thought processes influence environment, and environment in turn influences human behavior, human thought processes, and human psychology in general. We touched upon 3 or 4 things in this context. We touched upon the concept of personal space in environmental psychology. Personal space is the area around one's body that one considers one's personal domain. We also touched upon the concept of territoriality that environmental psychologists have borrowed from comparative psychology or animal psychology. मैंने आपको बताया कि एनिमल वर्ल्ड में एनिमल्स mark their territory, and if anybody else in the wildlife, we are talking about animals in the wildlife, and that if any other animal enters that marked area, the animals that have marked that territory attack that animal, either to make it run away from the marked area or they to damage and kill him. Some environmental psychologists regard territoriality, the effect of the territoriality, as one of the causes of wars and aggression in men against other men and other nations. We also touched upon environmental toxins, noise, pollution. All of these things are parts of environment and they impact human psychology. This is the area of environmental psychology. And these are two areas that we talked about. This is a part of the recent development of psychology in the 21st century. We will touch upon some other areas in the next lectures. Until then, look after yourselves. Khuda Hafiz. God be with you.